On a crisp morning, a small neighborhood nestled on the outskirts of the city remained unusually quiet. The streets were lined with well-kept houses, trees swaying gently in the breeze. The tranquility of the community was suddenly disrupted when a police car turned onto the street. Officer Greg Thornton had been patrolling the area when he noticed a figure slowly making his way down the sidewalk. The man was elderly, his hair graying with age, and he moved with a deliberate slowness that suggested his years had taken their toll. But there was something about him that struck Thornton as odd. The man wasn't just any resident. He appeared out of place in this upscale neighborhood. The officer parked his car and stepped out, his boots echoing on the pavement as he approached the man. His uniform was crisp, his sunglasses hiding most of his expressions, but the disdain was clear in his posture. "Hey, you," Officer Thornton called, his voice sharp. The elderly man turned, his eyes squinting slightly in the morning sun. He wore a plain suit, well worn but neat. His face was lined with age, but his eyes held a calm wisdom. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice soft but firm. "You're trespassing," Officer Thornton said, his tone laced with authority. "This is private property, and I don't recognize you. You need to leave immediately." The elderly man blinked, a slight chuckle escaping his lips. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, officer," the man said, his voice unwavering. "This is my property." Thornton took a step closer, a skeptical look in his eyes. "What are you talking about? You don't look like you belong around here." The elderly man stood taller, his back straightening despite his age. "I assure you, I've lived here longer than anyone else in this development." Thornton's disbelief was palpable. "Longer than anyone else? I don't know who you are, and you're clearly not one of the owners around here." The officer's eyes narrowed. There was something unsettling about this encounter. As the man turned slightly to walk away, Thornton followed, pulling out his radio. He needed backup. He was not going to let this man wander around, especially if he had something to hide. As the officer radioed for backup, the elderly man continued to stroll toward the nearby park. He seemed completely unbothered, his every step slow, yet purposeful. Thornton's patience wore thin as he tried to keep up with the man. "Stop right there," Thornton ordered. His voice, now tinged with frustration, carried across the quiet street. "I told you to leave." The elderly man paused, his face now clouded with a hint of annoyance. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until I've spoken with someone who knows what's going on here." Thornton took another step forward, pulling his handcuffs out of his belt. "Then you leave me no choice. You're under arrest for trespassing." The elderly man's face tightened, and for the first time a slight flash of anger appeared in his eyes. "You don't know who you're dealing with, officer." Before Thornton could respond, a car drove up, and the door opened. A middle-aged woman stepped out, her eyes wide with concern. She was wearing business attire, her heels clicking as she hurried toward the two men. "Greg, what's going on here?" the woman asked, her voice sharp. "Why are you bothering Mr. Parker?" Thornton glanced at the woman, his face blank. "This man is trespassing on private property. I've asked him to leave, but he refuses." The elderly man, Mr. Parker, turned to the woman with a calm expression. "It's all right, Diane. I'm just dealing with a misunderstanding." The woman's eyes flickered from Thornton to the elderly man. "You've got to be kidding me. You're arresting Mr. Parker?" Thornton's brow furrowed in confusion. "Do you know him?" "Know him?" Diane's voice was incredulous. "He's the owner of this entire development." The officer froze for a moment, his hand still hovering near his belt. He had heard rumors of a wealthy benefactor owning this area, but never had he imagined it would be this man. Thornton swallowed hard, suddenly realizing the gravity of the mistake he was about to make. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and now he had made an absolute fool of himself in front of one of the community's founders. Diane's eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and disbelief as she moved closer to the officer. "Greg, you need to get your head together. This is Mr. Parker. He owns the entire block. Every house, every street, everything." The officer was visibly stunned. His jaw slackened as the pieces began to fall into place. "Wait, you mean he owns all of this?" He gestured toward the rows of homes surrounding them. Diane nodded, her arms crossed. "That's right. This isn't some small-time development. Mr. Parker built this neighborhood from the ground up. Every single brick was laid by his hands and his vision." Thornton's face flushed a deep shade of red as the weight of his actions settled in. He had just accused the man responsible for the very land he stood on of trespassing. His knees felt weak, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what to do. "Mr. Parker," Diane began gently, This is all a misunderstanding. Greg didn't mean any harm. The elderly man, Mr. Parker, looked at her with an almost sad smile. It's all right, Diane. I understand. But it's not just the officer here that's the problem. It's the way things are changing around here. People forget where they came from. Officer Thornton's face was full of apology, but he couldn't seem to get the words out. He had misjudged the situation completely. I'm sorry, Thornton muttered, stepping back. I didn't know. I should have checked before jumping to conclusions. Mr. Parker turned slowly to face the officer, his eyes calm but piercing. It's not about checking, officer. It's about respect. You assumed things based on my appearance, not my history. Diane stood silently, observing the conversation with a mix of sympathy and relief. She had seen the tension between Mr. Parker and Thornton before, but never like this. She knew how difficult it was for Mr. Parker to remain composed in the face of such ignorance. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Parker said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. I built this neighborhood because I believed in the future of this community. I wanted to create something special, but I can't change the way people look at me just because of the color of my skin or my age. Thornton, now standing quietly, felt the sting of his own bias. He shifted uneasily from one foot to the other, trying to process the gravity of what he had done. You should have asked first, Mr. Parker continued, his voice calm but strong. It wouldn't have cost you anything to listen instead of rushing to judgment. The officer nodded, his face serious as he looked down at the ground, visibly ashamed. I didn't give you a chance. I made an assumption based on nothing but my own prejudice. The air around them was thick with tension as Mr. Parker's words sank in. Diane could feel the shift in the mood, a lesson in humility for everyone present. As the day wore on, Officer Thornton couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. He had always prided himself on being just, but in that moment, he had failed. He had seen an elderly black man and made a snap judgment that would haunt him for some time. That evening, as Thornton sat in his car, he reflected on his actions. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. The mistake was more than just a blunder. It was a reminder of how easy it was to let bias shape decisions. He reached for his phone and made a call. Diane, I want to apologize again to Mr. Parker. I'll come by and make it right. The next morning, Officer Thornton stood outside the door of Mr. Parker's home, nervously adjusting his uniform. He had spent the night reflecting on his mistake and knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to make up for what had happened. He had a lot to prove, not just to Mr. Parker, but to himself as well. Diane had insisted that Mr. Parker would be open to hearing his apology, but Thornton wasn't so sure. What he had done couldn't simply be brushed aside. He had assumed the worst of a man he didn't know, based on superficial judgments, and that had cost him dearly. As he rang the doorbell, his heart pounded in his chest. Moments later, the door opened, and Mr. Parker stood in front of him, looking as composed and dignified as ever. Officer Thornton, Mr. Parker said, his voice calm but with a certain firmness. What brings you here? Thornton took a deep breath, then met Mr. Parker's eyes. I'm here to apologize. For everything. The way I treated you yesterday. It was wrong. I didn't give you the respect you deserved, and for that, I'm truly sorry. Mr. Parker nodded slowly, but his eyes betrayed no emotion. He didn't speak right away, letting the silence hang between them. Thornton fidgeted, unsure if he would receive the forgiveness he sought. I appreciate the apology, Mr. Parker said after a moment, but it's not about me. It's about changing the way things are done around here. People like you, like me, we can't afford to make assumptions based on the color of someone's skin, or their age, or how they look. Thornton nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I've learned that lesson, he said quietly, and I'm committed to changing. But that doesn't mean I don't need to make it right with you. I wanted to come here in person and make sure you know how sorry I am for treating you like I did. Mr. Parker looked at him thoughtfully, his gaze intense. He seemed to be weighing Thornton's sincerity. Then, without warning, he extended his hand. I believe you, but let's make sure this isn't just a lesson for you. Let's make it a lesson for everyone in this community. Thornton took the elderly man's hand, grateful for the opportunity to make amends. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure something like this never happens again. Mr. Parker nodded. Good. And remember, actions speak louder than words. A week later, a meeting was scheduled at the local community center. Mr. Parker had asked Thornton to be present, and Diane had helped to arrange it. The purpose of the gathering was clear: to address the recent incident and to ensure that the residents of the community, Both black and white could come together and learn from what had happened. The meeting room was full by the time Thornton arrived. The small crowd buzzed with quiet conversation, but when Mr. Parker entered, all noise ceased. His presence filled the room, and everyone, whether they had known him for years or had just met him, understood that this man was a leader. He didn't need to announce it. It was written in the way he carried himself. Thornton entered shortly after, greeted with a mix of curious and wary glances. The police officer's reputation had taken a hit, but he was determined to make things right. He took a seat near the back, waiting for Mr. Parker to begin. Mr. Parker stood before the group, his calm demeanor commanding their attention. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steady but resonant. "I've asked you here today because we've all learned something from the events of last week. The truth is, this neighborhood is about more than just property. It's about people. It's about respect. It's about treating each other with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We've seen what can happen when we forget that. Officer Thornton made a mistake, and I'm sure we've all made mistakes in our own ways, but the key is not to dwell on those mistakes. It's to learn from them, to change the way we think and act, to do better moving forward." Thornton stood up, his voice slightly nervous but sincere. "I'm not here to make excuses. What I did was wrong. I shouldn't have judged Mr. Parker based on his appearance. I should have respected him from the start, and I didn't. And I'm truly sorry for that." He took a deep breath and continued, "But I want to make sure something like this never happens again. I'll be working with Mr. Parker and the community to ensure that respect is at the core of everything we do here." The room was silent for a moment as the crowd absorbed his words. Then, slowly, applause broke out, and a few people stood to shake his hand. Thornton felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully make up for his actions, but this was a start. As the meeting came to an end, people filtered out of the room, shaking hands, exchanging nods, and talking quietly amongst themselves. Thornton remained behind, sitting quietly for a few moments as he reflected on the changes that had taken place, both in the community and in himself. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that he knew he couldn't forget. The world had a way of teaching hard lessons, but those lessons could make someone stronger if they were willing to learn, and he was determined to keep learning. Mr. Parker walked up to him as the last of the residents left the room. His eyes were no longer filled with frustration, but with understanding. "You did well today, Officer Thornton," Mr. Parker said. "But this is just the beginning. We've got a long way to go." Thornton nodded. "I know, but I'm ready for the journey." Mr. Parker gave him a small smile. "Good, because it's not just about one mistake. It's about how you keep moving forward." The two men stood in silence for a moment, looking out the window at the quiet neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the houses. It felt like a new chapter had begun, not just for Thornton but for everyone in the community. And though the road ahead would be difficult, it was one they would walk together.